The scream tore through the night as flames burst through the deck of the steamship Erie. It was just after 8 p.m. on August 9th, 1841. One moment, the ship was rolling through heavy summer swells on Lake Erie. The next, a muffled blast shook the hull from below. A violent hiss followed, then fire shot upward with explosive force. Flames raced across the wooden decks, leapt up stairwells, and poured into cabins already suffocating from sealed portholes and trapped heat. Smoke thickened instantly. Corridors vanished into darkness. Mothers screamed for children. Men tried to force doors open only to find walls of flame blocking every exit. The lifeboats could not be lowered fast enough. The engines could not be stopped. The ship was still moving forward, carrying fire with it. Passengers faced an impossible choice: burn where they stood or leap into the black, storm-tossed water below. So if you had only 12 minutes left, in that situation, what would you do? The early 19th century was an age of restless expansion in the United States. The young nation was no longer content to cling to the Atlantic coastline. It was pushing westward, toward fertile land, opportunity, trade, and power. But geography stood in the way. The Appalachian Mountains formed a natural barrier between the original 13 colonies and the vast interior of the continent. Moving people and goods across that barrier was slow, expensive, and often dangerous. If America was going to expand, it needed arteries, routes that could carry commerce, settlers, and ambition deep into the frontier. New York possessed a rare geographic advantage. To the east, it had New York Harbor, already one of the busiest ports in the world. To the west, it bordered Lake Erie, gateway to the immense Great Lakes system. Running through the state was the Hudson River, flowing south to the Atlantic Ocean. The question was simple: could these natural waterways be connected? As early as the 1780s, proposals emerged for a canal linking the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. For decades, the idea seemed impossible. Too ambitious, too expensive, too audacious. The federal government hesitated. Critics mocked it as folly. But New York's Governor DeWitt Clinton and state leaders pressed forward. In 1817, the state legislature authorized construction. What followed was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century. The Erie Canal stretched 363 miles, 584 kilometers, across New York State. Construction took 8 years. Sections opened to traffic beginning on May 17, 1821. The full canal was completed on October 26, 1825. At the time, it was the second longest canal in the world, surpassed only by China's Grand Canal. For the first time in history, the Great Lakes were directly linked to the Atlantic Ocean. The impact was immediate and transformative. Transportation costs plummeted, trade volumes surged. Buffalo, located where the Erie Canal met Lake Erie near the Niagara River, became a thriving shipping hub almost overnight. Grain, flour, whiskey, lumber, and manufactured goods flowed east and west in unprecedented quantities. More importantly, people flowed with them. The canal did not simply move cargo, it moved lives. With this surge in trade came a new demand for faster, more reliable vessels on the Great Lakes? The answer had already begun to emerge. In 1807, Robert Fulton demonstrated the commercial viability of steam power with his North River steamboat. Steam propulsion quickly revolutionized American waterways. Unlike sail-powered vessels, steamships didn't depend on favorable winds. They could maintain schedules. They could move upriver. They could dominate trade routes. By the late 1830s, Buffalo Harbor was crowded with paddle steamers serving ports across the Great Lakes. Among the businessmen who recognized the opportunity was Charles Manning Reed, son of one of Erie, Pennsylvania's earliest settlers. Reed invested heavily in steam navigation, building a fleet to capitalize on the expanding market. In 1837, he acquired his largest vessel yet, a wooden-hulled, side-wheel passenger freighter built by the Erie Steamboat Company in Erie, Pennsylvania. She was launched on October 17, 1837, and named the Erie. At 496 gross registered tons, measuring 176 feet 8 inches in length, 53.85 meters, with a beam of 27 feet 4 inches, 8.33 meters. The Erie was one of the larger vessels operating on the lakes at the time. She was powered by a low-pressure steam engine using a walking beam configuration, a distinctive design common on American riverboats in the 1830s and 1840s. A massive reinforced beam, mounted high above the deck, moved up and down like a seesaw as steam pressure drove the pistons. That motion turned two large, side-mounted paddle wheels. The walking beam design allowed for relatively shallow draft, making it ideal for inland waters. It also made the vessel top-heavy, a compromise accepted in exchange for speed and efficiency. And speed she had. The Erie could reach nearly 14 knots, making her one of the fastest ships on the Great Lakes at the time. But speed alone did not fill passenger manifests. Comfort did. The passenger trade was fiercely competitive. Reed understood that travelers, especially those journeying long distances, valued refinement. The Erie was fitted with spacious passenger accommodations divided between men and women. She offered 12 private staterooms for wealthier travelers. Her cabins were well appointed with fine furnishings. On deck were benches and seating areas where passengers could enjoy the open air during calmer weather. Officially, she could accommodate around 250 passengers. In practice, with deck space utilized, she often carried 300 or more. Her crew numbered between 35 and 40. Yet beneath this image of speed and elegance lay a stark reality. Safety standards were minimal by modern understanding. The Erie carried only 3 lifeboats. She had between 60 and 100 life preservers for a vessel that could carry over 300 people. At the time, this was not unusual. Regulations were limited. Oversight was sparse. The culture of maritime safety that would emerge later in the 19th and 20th centuries simply did not yet exist. Progress was measured in speed and profit, not in preparedness. To command this impressive vessel, Charles Reed selected Captain Thomas Jefferson Titus, known as J. Titus. Born at the end of President Thomas Jefferson's second term, Titus was only 30 years old but already a seasoned mariner. He had been sailing the Great Lakes since the age of 16 and had served as a master for 9 years, commanding schooners and steamships alike. Reed was a respected shipping magnate. He could choose the best, and he chose Titus. The captain's reputation on the lakes was strong. Experienced, competent, reliable, the Erie departed on her maiden voyage from Erie to Buffalo on May 26, 1838. 2 days later, on May 28th, she left Buffalo bound for Cleveland, Ohio. Mechanical trouble struck on that early voyage. Her engines failed on the final leg, and she had to be towed into port. But repairs were swift. By June 2, 1838, she resumed service. For the next 3 years, the Erie delivered on her promise. She ran regular routes between Buffalo and Chicago, linking the East to the rapidly growing Midwest. Buffalo Harbor continued to thrive as eastbound and westbound cargo surged through the Erie Canal. Merchants traveled with goods. Businessmen moved between expanding cities. Excursionists ventured west to explore opportunity. And then there were the immigrants. European migrants, German, Swiss, Irish, and others, arrived in American ports and journeyed inland through the canal system. They were seeking farmland, employment, and a better life for their families. The Erie carried them westward across Lake Erie, one segment of a long and often exhausting migration. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, this route was bustling. The Buffalo-Chicago corridor was alive with traffic. Steamships symbolized modernity, ambition, and national confidence. The Great Lakes were no longer remote frontiers. They were commercial highways. This was the high tide of American industrial optimism. But it was also an era when risk was normalized. Deck space was routinely used for cargo storage. Hazardous materials were not subject to strict regulation. Fire prevention systems were primitive. Life-saving equipment was limited. The same drive that built canals across mountains and steamships across inland seas also fostered a culture that accepted danger as the price of advancement. The Erie embodied that paradox. Wait, she was fast, she was elegant, she was profitable. She represented the triumph of engineering and enterprise. Yet she carried only 3 lifeboats. She sailed with insufficient life preservers. And she operated in an age when the belief in progress often overshadowed caution. By the summer of 1841, the Erie had become a familiar sight on Lake Erie, a symbol of connection between East and West. No one boarding her on August 9, 1841, saw her as fragile. No one imagined that beneath her polished decks and proud walking beam engine lay vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic. The tragedy that followed did not emerge from obscurity. It emerged from a system, an era, where innovation outpaced regulation and speed outpaced safety. That world was racing forward, confident, ambitious, and unprepared for the cost. On August 9, 1841, in Buffalo, as the ship prepared for its routine westbound voyage to Chicago, a group of painters boarded the vessel. They had just finished applying a fresh coat of white paint to the Erie. Their next destination was Erie, Pennsylvania, where they were scheduled to work on another ship named James Madison, one of Erie's sister ships. They brought their supplies with them: kegs and jars of lead-based paint, numerous bottles of turpentine, at least one case of varnish, chemicals used to thin and strengthen the paint, brushes, tools, equipment. Heavy, volatile, flammable cargo. Instead of being lowered into the ship's cargo hold, the materials were placed on the upper deck, midship, directly above the ventilation housing that covered the boiler room 11 feet below. That location mattered. The area above the boiler had caught fire at least 3 times before the cruise. The crew knew it. First Mate Dennis McBride, who normally supervised cargo loading and was aware of the prior fire issues, happened to be off duty that day. The deck had recently been reinforced with more durable materials during an overhaul, and many believed the earlier fire problems were now a thing of the past. Besides, the painters were only going to be aboard for a few hours. Lowering the heavy barrels into the hold and then hauling them back out again at the next stop seemed unnecessary, an inconvenience. So the supplies stayed on deck, above heat, above steam, above systems that never truly cooled. Fully loaded with passengers and cargo, the Erie departed Buffalo in the early evening of August 9th, 1841. The night was warm and humid. A series of summer storms churned the waters of Lake Erie, but nothing about the weather suggested catastrophe. The ship pressed westward, as she had so many times before. Dinner, known then as tea, had been served. Many passengers, unable to tolerate the stifling air below deck, remained outside. The heavy seas had forced the crew to close the portholes, sealing the cabins against spray but also trapping heat inside. The interior became oppressive, a humid, suffocating space. On deck, families sat together. German and Swiss immigrants, nearing the end of a long journey west, put their children to bed early and spoke quietly among themselves. For them, this voyage represented hope. Among the crew was 11-year-old Andrew Blah, a bilingual cabin boy from Harbor Creek, Pennsylvania. His job was to carry messages between officers and crew in an era before onboard communication systems. He shared quarters with wheelsman Jerome McBride. Just after 8 p.m., Andrew heard it, a dull thud, then a strange hissing sound. Unfamiliar with the deeper workings of a steamship, Andrew asked Jerome what it was. Jerome, nearing his night shift and wanting rest, dismissed it. Perhaps a blown boiler head, nothing serious. But the sound unsettled the boy. Moments later, commotion erupted on deck. Andrew opened the cabin door and was met by a wall of fire. The paint, turpentine, and varnish stored above the boiler had been heating for hours. Vapors, colorless, invisible, deadly, had accumulated. All it took was a spark. When it came, the fumes ignited with explosive force. Flames did not creep across the deck. They detonated. In seconds, the fire spread in every direction at once. The wooden decking became fuel. Stairways turned into chimneys. The blaze poured downward into the steerage cabin below and outward across the main deck. Jerome reacted instantly. He grabbed 2 blankets, threw one to Andrew, and ordered him to hold it in front of himself as protection. They rushed toward the gangplank. Jerome pushed it into the water and told Andrew to jump. The boy obeyed, plunging into the dark lake and clinging to the floating plank. Jerome, already badly burned, followed. Behind them, the Erie was transforming into an inferno. At the moment the fire broke out, the ship was approximately 6 to 7 miles offshore near Silver Creek, roughly halfway between Buffalo and Erie, Pennsylvania. Captain T.J. Titus was on duty. When informed of the blaze, he reacted immediately. He ordered wheelsman Luther Fuller to turn the ship south toward shore, hoping to beach her or at least reduce the distance survivors would have to swim. He instructed Fuller to remain at the helm and hold the course. Then Titus ran to the ladies' lounge, where several life preservers were stored. But when he arrived, it was already too late. The lounge was engulfed in flames. The life preservers were burning. The very equipment meant to save lives was being consumed before it could be used. Titus returned to the deck to find chaos. First engineer Edgar Clemens had already attempted to reach the engine room to shut down the boilers. He failed. The lower decks were inaccessible, choked by smoke and fire. When ordered again to stop the engines, Clemens replied that if he went below now, he would not come back. The engines continued to drive the paddle wheels, and the Erie, fully ablaze, kept moving forward. This detail would prove fatal. Second mate William Hughes tried to organize a bucket brigade to fight the flames. Within moments, it was clear the effort was hopeless. The fire's intensity made coordinated action impossible. Attention shifted to launching the 3 lifeboats. 3 boats. For over 300 people. Passengers surged toward them in panic. Hughes was forced to push people back just to lower the boats. But because the engines were still running and the vessel was moving at speed, 2 of the lifeboats were swamped almost immediately. After being lowered, they capsized in the churning water. Only 1 small yawl successfully cleared the ship. On deck, the situation deteriorated by the second. Smoke thickened, blinding and suffocating. Flames burst through railings and erupted from stairwells. Clothing caught fire. Parents searched frantically for children. Some passengers climbed down the rudder chains, attempting escape along the stern. Several became entangled and fell. With no accessible life preservers and almost no functioning boats, passengers faced a brutal choice: remain on a burning deck or jump into dark, wind-driven water. Many jumped, but clothing in 1841 was heavy, particularly for women. Even in summer, dresses and layered garments dragged in the water. Without flotation, many who leapt from the ship sank almost immediately. All of this unfolded in 12 minutes. 12 minutes from the first explosion to the moment Captain Titus stepped into the only lifeboat that cleared the vessel. In those 12 minutes, the upper works of the Erie were consumed. Cabins turned into furnaces. The deck became impassable. Hundreds were driven overboard. The ship remained under power, spreading fire and preventing effective evacuation. By the time Titus abandoned the vessel, he was nearly alone on deck. Around him, screams pierced the night. Flames roared skyward, visible for miles. The once gleaming white paddle steamer had become a floating pillar of fire on Lake Erie. Inside the saloon, barkeep Frederick Parmley had just finished preparing a drink for a passenger. The 2 men had settled into a card game, the storm rocking the vessel beneath them. Then came the blast. The room shuddered. A strange hiss followed, and then fire swallowed the only exit. Flames surged through the saloon doorway so quickly that hesitation meant death. Parmley and the unnamed passenger did not hesitate. They ran straight through the fire, forcing their way past the burning threshold. Their clothing caught sparks. The heat seared their skin. but they made it onto the deck. The dozen or so others inside the saloon did not. They paused, confused, disoriented, hoping perhaps the fire could be controlled. That pause cost them everything. The flames closed in, trapping them. Not a single one survived. On deck, Parmley found chaos. The fire was not isolated, it was everywhere. Crew members struggled with the lifeboats. Families clung to one another, searching frantically for missing children. Clothing ignited as sparks drifted through the air. Smoke thickened, stinging eyes and choking lungs. Passengers were already leaping overboard in waves. The heat drove Parmley toward the side of the ship. He climbed down and saw one of the vessel's large fenders, cushions used to protect the hull while docking. With presence of mind amid madness, he cut it loose and wrapped his arms around it. As the Erie burned above him, he pushed away from the hull and kicked into the dark water. Elsewhere on the vessel, another story was unfolding, one of foresight, love, and hesitation. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Lynde were on the final leg of their honeymoon. For reasons unknown, they had brought their own life preservers, devices that required inflation by breath. As the fire advanced, they began blowing air into their vests while chaos swirled around them. They were part of a group forced toward the stern as flames consumed the forward decks. With no other escape, passengers began climbing down the rudder chains at the rear of the ship. It was a desperate descent, made more dangerous by panic and smoke. Mrs. Lynde turned to her husband and cried, "Come, Charles, we must jump over." She leapt. She caught hold of the rudder chain and began lowering herself toward the water. But when she looked back, Charles was not behind her. For reasons no one can fully explain, fear, confusion, a moment's doubt, he hesitated. That hesitation sealed his fate. Mrs. Lynde made it clear of the burning ship. Her inflated vest kept her afloat in the churning waves. Alone in the darkness, she watched as the inferno consumed the vessel and her husband. Meanwhile, Second Mate William Hughes fought to impose order on the chaos. When the fire first broke out, Hughes rushed to inform Captain Titus. Then he attempted to organize a bucket brigade, hoping to fight the flames. It was a futile effort. The fire had ignited too violently to spread too quickly. Within moments, Hughes abandoned the attempt to extinguish the blaze and turned instead to evacuation. 3 lifeboats. He fought through panicked passengers to lower them. He had to push people back, forcing order in a situation where reason was collapsing. But because the engines were still running and the ship was moving forward, 2 of the boats were swamped almost immediately after being lowered. They overturned in the waves. Only one small yawl cleared the burning ship. At the helm, wheelsman Luther Fuller remained at his post. Captain Titus had ordered him to steer south toward shore, hoping to beach the vessel or at least bring it closer to land. Fuller obeyed. Even as flames burst around the pilot house, even as smoke poured in, he held the wheel. He fought to keep the ship on course. Only when the steering gear failed, destroyed by heat and fire, did he abandon his position. Badly burned, he leapt into the lake. He would later be pulled from the water barely alive. He did not survive his injuries. His final act was one of duty. Back on deck, the inferno intensified. Flames erupted from railings. The wooden deck beneath passengers' feet began to burn through. People stumbled, slipped, fell. Some were already on fire as they ran. Others climbed down chains and ropes. only to become tangled and plunge into the water. The Erie had become what survivors would later describe as a floating hell. The lake reflected the blaze, turning black water into a field of flickering orange. Screams echoed across the surface. Men shouted for wives. Mothers cried out for children. The sound was carried by wind and punctuated by the roar of fire. Captain T.J. Titus moved across the deck, attempting to restore order where none could exist. He had tried to reach the life preservers. He had ordered the engine stopped. He had commanded the turn toward shore. But now the reality was undeniable. The ship was lost. He turned to First Engineer Edgar Clemens and told him as much. As flames surrounded him, Titus looked around and realized he was nearly alone on deck. There was nothing left to command. No further orders to give. He spotted the only lifeboat that had successfully cleared the vessel, a small yawl drifting near the stern. 3 injured men clung to its sides. Instinct overtook authority. Captain Titus stepped into the boat. It had been approximately 12 minutes since the first explosion. 12 minutes from routine voyage to total destruction. As he pulled away, the Erie was fully engulfed. Around her, the lake was filled with heads, men, women, children, bobbing in the dark water, illuminated by the inferno behind them. Some clung to floating debris. Some held on to each other. Many disappeared beneath the surface. The ship that had symbolized progress, speed, and comfort now stood as a blazing monument to vulnerability. As the Erie burned against the black horizon of Lake Erie, her flames became a beacon. Miles away, crews and townspeople saw the unnatural glow. Among them was the 415-ton paddle steamer DeWitt Clinton, which had departed Buffalo 4 hours earlier on the same route. When her crew spotted the reddish-orange pillar rising into the night sky, they understood immediately. Another vessel was in mortal danger. Without hesitation, the Clinton turned back. Steam was pushed harder. Lifeboats were readied. Men braced themselves for what they were about to witness. By the time the DeWitt Clinton reached the scene, the once white upper works of the Erie had been reduced to a smoldering skeleton. The hull glowed dull red in the darkness. The lake around her was filled with scattered survivors, heads bobbing, arms reaching, voices crying out into the wind. Rescue began in chaos. Small boats were lowered from the Clinton. Survivors were pulled from floating debris, from makeshift rafts, from the open water itself. Some had clung to boards torn from the burning decks. Others held onto fenders, spars, or fragments of shattered wood. Among the acts of courage that night, one stands out with quiet clarity. Edward Johnson, a cook in the Erie's galley and one of the few black crew members aboard, had jumped into the water moments after the fire began. He found a piece of wood to hold on to and eventually made his way to the small yawl carrying Captain Titus and several injured men. In the darkness, they heard a woman crying for help. It was Mrs. Lind, the honeymoon bride who had leapt without hesitation while her husband remained behind. She floated on her back, her privately purchased life preserver keeping her barely above water in the rolling waves. Johnson asked Captain Titus for permission to go to her. Titus agreed. Johnson swam into the black water, guided only by her voice. He reached her, steadied her, and helped bring her toward the overcrowded yawl. The boat was nearly swamped already. Mrs. Lind chose to remain in the water, holding onto its side as the group awaited rescue. That decision, his decision to swim toward danger rather than away from it, saved her life. Elsewhere in the water, First Engineer Edgar Clemens fought his own battle for survival. After being unable to shut down the engines, he had leapt from the burning ship, severely burning his hands when he unknowingly grabbed a railing already engulfed in flame. Once in the lake, he did not think only of himself. He gathered floating lumber and pushed it toward 3 struggling children, giving them something to cling to. Only after ensuring they had support did he secure a floating box for himself. Eventually, he too was pulled aboard the Clinton. And then there was Luther Fuller, the wheelsman who had remained at the helm while fire consumed the pilot house. The man who kept steering south toward shore, even as heat and smoke closed in around him. He had obeyed his orders to the very end. When the steering gear failed and the flames forced him to abandon his post, he leapt into the lake, badly burned. Fuller was pulled from the water alive. He did not survive. His injuries were too severe. His body had absorbed the full cost of duty. By the DeWitt Clinton and other rescuers had pulled every survivor they could find from the water. Fewer than 100 people were saved. At the time, early reports estimated that 170 lives had been lost, but the fire had destroyed the passenger and crew manifests. Later historical research suggests that 343 people had been aboard the Erie that night. If that number is correct, as many as 254 perished, many burned, many drowned. Clothing in 1841, especially women's garments, was heavy and layered, even in summer. Without adequate life preservers, those who jumped often sank almost immediately. The ship carried only 3 lifeboats and between 60 and 100 life preservers, far too few for the number of passengers and crew. The cause was tragically clear. Volatile paint supplies, lead-based paint, turpentine, varnish, had been stored directly above the boiler room. Heat from the boilers caused fumes to accumulate. When a spark ignited those vapors shortly after 8 p.m., the explosion and fire spread with unstoppable speed. There were no meaningful safety protocols to prevent it, no strict regulation governing hazardous cargo placement, no sufficient life-saving equipment. The Erie, still smoldering, was briefly taken under tow in an attempt to bring her back to port. But the burned-out hull broke free. Soon after, she sank beneath the surface of Lake Erie. The flames disappeared. The water closed over the wreck, and time moved on. The tragedy of the Erie did not become as famous as later maritime disasters. It faded slowly into the margins of history. But that does not diminish its meaning. What happened on August 9, 1841, was not merely an accident at sea. It was a snapshot of an era when industrial progress surged forward at breathtaking speed. Canals cut through mountains, steam engines conquered distance, commerce expanded beyond imagination. But safety lagged behind. Regulations were minimal. Risk was normalized. The very technology that promised connection and prosperity carried hidden vulnerability. And yet within that vulnerability there was courage. A cook who swam toward a stranger's cry. An engineer who handed floating timber to children before securing his own survival. A wheelsman who stayed at the helm until fire destroyed the controls. A captain who remained until nothing more could be done. They remind us that even in systems that fail, individuals can rise. The lives lost aboard the Erie were not expendable casualties of progress. They were immigrants chasing opportunity, merchants conducting business, newlyweds beginning their future, children crossing into possibility. They trusted the promise of modern industry. They believed in the safety of the age they were entering. History owes them remembrance, and we owe them reflection. Because progress without responsibility is fragile. Because innovation without protection is incomplete. And because every advance in human achievement must be measured not only by how far it carries us, but by how safely it brings us there. Finally, thank you for staying with me through the story of August 9th, 1841, through the 12 minutes that changed 343 lives on Lake Erie. These aren't just numbers from the past. They are people whose courage and loss still speak to us today. If this story moved you, I truly appreciate your support. Please consider liking, sharing, and following so we can continue remembering stories like this together. Your engagement helps keep these histories alive. I'm deeply grateful for your time, and I hope to see you again in our next story.